visions, for like a solar punk future kind of come together like in that like communicative process, which I think is what really excites me. Isn't necessarily like what the future itself is that's like solar punk, but like sort of that like, you know, conversations and like steps that we take like right now to sort of get there.
Cool. Sounds great. Do you know Gary Sheng?
he did the GitcoinDAO
Yeah.
that we're a part of. Yeah.
Super.
He was our intro to all of the whole world of region Web3 and stuff. And Oliver, isn't that open to is it open to the public now, the study group?
Yeah, I think we're sort of open to, anybody who's in the DreamDAO server, just popping in for study sessions. We're like on pause over the month of June, but I think we'll be starting again. Hopefully, I think, the first couple weeks of July, and then, but yeah, so anybody who wants to have some solar punk conversations with us, we're happy to have.
Yeah, for those of you who are just joining, Oliver was sharing about how he leads a solar punk study group where they know fiction and talk about it. So if you're interested in do and message Oliver. Yeah, and then also Matt, I don't know if I told you this, but during the call we have conversations in the thread under the Public Goods Library. I just tagged you in it, so you don't have to pay attention to it like during your presentation, but if you want to take a look like after and like see what people were talking about, and like people always like drop resources and stuff too, so that's there for you as a resource.
Okay, great.
Who all is here in New York? I know Maxwell, QZ, and Jahi and Oliver. Who else is here? Anyone else?
QZ is there.
Yeah, QZ. I've seen QZ 5 times since he got here on Thursday, and I'm seeing him again today because we're going to DAO NYC.
Yeah, it's like I'm just here to visit Madison.
Basically, QZ, like the way that Jahi, Oliver, and I describe it is like when we're out with QZ, we're like sponges, and he just like shares all of his wisdom, and we absorb it. So yeah, hanging out with QZ is fun.
Thanks for the free dinners too.
Yeah. Cool. So I think that we're about ready to get started, but Matt, I gotta hype you up first and do some announcements before I let you start your presentation. So hello everyone, I'm Madison. I'm gonna be helping facilitate the call today. But I'll note that today, like last week, I have to hop off about 5 minutes early because right after this in DAO Vibes, we're going to be doing a GR14 showcase because GR14 is about to come to a close, where people can pitch their grants. So if you have time after, feel free to hop in to hear about some grants, or if you have a grant, you can pitch your own. And today we have a really special guest that I'm really excited to introduce. So Matt Pruitt is the president of Radical Exchange Foundation. For those of you who don't know, Radical Exchange is a global movement for next generation political economies. He's also a lawyer, writer, and a programmer. And Matt, by the way, QZ found your CoinDesk article, I think like a week ago, and was like, "Wait, is this who's speaking at the library next week?" Like, I'm so excited. So found it before like you shared it as a resource too. But today we're diving into the topic of money has a universal problem, and maybe we can address it. And Matt has a presentation ready for us, and after that, we will open it up for any questions and discussion. And as always, like I mentioned earlier, feel free to leave any resources, questions, and just chat in the thread. I'll tag you all in there so you can see it. It's under the Public Goods Library channel. And then the last thing is, before we get started, is a reminder about the club. Those are getting started back up again, and they're hosted by Henry in the Common Room. Information is in the announcement Len sent on Monday, and it will be on Thursday at 6:45 p.m. Eastern. But he's considering doing an alternate time moving forward. So if you have any preferences, you can just message him and share that. Okay, I think that's everything. Matt, feel free to share anything that I missed that you want to include about yourself. Then feel free to get started on your presentation.
No, that sounds great. Is this being recorded? Is there like will there be a recording of this episode?
Yes, there's a live stream. It's being streamed on YouTube.
Okay, awesome. Super. So thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you all. I will. So I'll give a short presentation, and basically about money, about sort of some thoughts about how to essentially rethink what money is and how it might work better. But what it might mean. Is to ask you to sort of relax your priors, and what I mean by this is take the sort of definitions that you have in your mind about what money is and what it's supposed to do and why we use it, and try to just kind of put those to the side for a second, because I might use some words in a way that is a little different from how you use them, and I'm definitely going to explain kind of an unfamiliar vision of what money is and what it might do. But so yeah, so just try to sort of have a blank slate and follow my argument. Okay, so the first claim that I want to make is that money is broken, that the institution of money really doesn't do what we want it to do. And the second claim that I want to make is that we can make it less broken. Let me just point out that these are both actually sort of controversial or arguably controversial claims, right? Because some people think that money really works well, that it's like, one of the most effective kind of institutions that we have, and that it's responsible for lots of human progress. And on a certain level, I don't dispute that, but I do want to claim that there's something wrong with it, which I'll explain more about. And then the second claim is that we can make it less broken, right? This is also controversial, right? Some people think that money doesn't work well, but they think that there's just really nothing that we can do about that. I think that there are things we can do about that. All right. There's something. Okay, so why is money broken? What do I mean by this? Think about it this way. So many of the best things that you can do for money are not great for other people, or not great for your community. Here's what I mean by that. I will not pick on any professions other than my own, but for example, I used to be a corporate lawyer, which is it's a pretty good way of making money. But I think that if you kind of think about, how to best spend your time and how to best serve the community and provide public goods and things like that, it's actually like a terrible way to spend your time, right? It's there's something about it's easy to think of much more beneficial things you could do than to be a corporate lawyer, and yet it's a very a good way of making money. And while I'm not going to go through I'm not going to run through professions and criticize them, but suffice to say, I think that's true of a lot of other things that you can do to make money besides being a lawyer. And on the other hand, many of the best things that you can do for other people or for your community are not very profitable at all. For example, if you think about being a teacher, if you think about the benefit that you can have by being a teacher, it's kind of amazing, right? You can you can affect the entire trajectory of people's lives. You can, cause their entire course of their education to go better, which makes the rest of their lives go better in very, very important ways, which causes people to affect the people around them in a positive way. This kind of effect can like compound across generations. It's really amazing how much good you can do by being a teacher and doing a good job at it. And yet it is not a high-paying profession. And there's lots of other examples of this. Like you could, volunteer at a hospice. You could volunteer at a prison. There are lots of these just kind of incredibly easy, obvious opportunities laying around to do immense good for your community that that turn out not to be very good ways of making money. And in a way, this is obvious, right? This sort of misalignment between financial incentives and the incentives to, and the activities that are beneficial to your community are sort of obvious, which is why our societies are full of rules, basically, right? So we try to like forbid corrupt things. We try to say, for example, if you're a politician, you're not allowed to accept a bribe. Etc. And we try to encourage good things. We try to say, in order to get more people to do these beneficial things that that we want people to do, that strengthen their communities and so on, we try to set up other kinds of workarounds. We try to say, okay, if you're a teacher, then you'll have the esteem of your community. If you volunteer, you'll be respected. Things like this. Or on the other hand, we sort of try to like browbeat each other into being like more ethical consumers, right? So we'll say, don't support companies that do bad things and support companies that work in a more ethical way or whatever, right? So in other words, we're trying, and through that avenue, we're trying to sort of, improve the monetary incentives for good behavior a little bit. But honestly, let's take a step back and admit that it's really, really not working that well, right? This kind of macroscopic like misalignment between what money tends to reward and what is good for your community, it seems to be very, very persistent and quite strong. And all of the sort of rules that we have set up to try to forbid corrupt things and encourage good things haven't had the as strong of an effect as we would like them to have. But maybe it's not just us, right? Maybe it's not just that we like haven't put enough rules in place and or that we haven't taken strong enough action to encourage things that are good for communities. Maybe there's something actually about the institution of money itself that results in this kind of distortion, and that can help sort of explain the persistence of this misalignment. And that's what I want to suggest today. And I'll explain why. So money's supposed to facilitate exchange, right? The idea behind it is that it makes it easier for people to like transact in things that they need. And here's what that looks like. So let's say this is you. You have some endowment of assets. So in this case, let's say you have a nice espresso machine. And there's lots of other people out there in society, right? And those other people in society have different sort of willingnesses to pay for the asset that you have. So these dollar signs above their heads represent the like differing willingnesses to pay for the espresso machine. And so what you do is you figure out who is willing to pay the most. And if that's more than the machine is worth to you, then you make the trade. And you give the espresso machine away and you get the money. And that's basically how money works. This is efficient, right? I mean, there's an obvious sort of efficiency to this. But what I want to point out is this actually draws our attention away from the needs of our communities in a very simple but actually very deep and very systematic way. Here's what I mean. So now let's say we've got you, you've got an espresso machine, and there's still all these other people out there in society with different willingnesses to pay for the espresso machine, but we'll change the hypothetical slightly. Let's say there's also other people who are closer to you, right? So this is intended to represent the idea that there are people in your community, and I mean the word community very, very broadly here, right? I mean, this could be like family, this could be people who live close to you, it could be people that you know, it could be people in your professional network or whatever. But in any case, people who are somehow sort of, proximate to you. And those other people within your community, they also have like willingnesses to pay for the espresso machine. But what money encourages you to do, what the institution of like, dollars, let's say, or euros or whatever, encourages you to do, is to instead of considering the needs of your community, right? Instead of considering like how that espresso machine could best serve your community, it encourages you to sort of put everybody on equal footing and just evaluate them in terms of like, just evaluate their needs in terms of how much money they have, so that you will value the needs of the person who's not in your community with $4 signs more than you'll value the needs of the person in your community with $2 signs. So you send the espresso machine to the highest bidder. But what this does is this attenuates your relationship with your community a little bit, right? It encourages you not to think, or not to like focus on what the needs of your community are, but instead just to focus on what the global highest bidder's needs are. And while it might seem small, this does kind of attenuate your relationship with your community, right? And if we kind of if we extrapolate this, we can see how it can, this sort of universal unit of account of money, which has no regard for like these different structures of community, can erode community ties. So if we sort of extrapolate it across the across like every transaction in a global economy, we can see how the way that money directs our attention away from our communities can kind of just gradually have this attenuating or attritive effect on our communities, slowly sort of weakening the ties that bind them, and putting us in a world where instead of being clustered into community, we're a little bit more like equidistant, and basically the primary variable that sort of characterizes us in the world and that characterizes our relationships with others is not which community or communities we are participating in, but rather how much money we have. And so to me this feels a lot like the actual world that we live in, right? I mean, I think that this effect that that like universal money systems have of kind of thrusting us into a less socially structured, less community structured world in which we're more individuals or more atomized, and money is the main thing mediating our relationship with others. To me that rings true. That seems like, that feels like the world that we live in. But imagine if money didn't do this, or didn't do this as strongly. Imagine if money didn't draw our attention away from our communities in this way. What might that look like? Okay, so here imagine, again, we've got sort of the rest of the world, and then we've got you within a community. instead of like, you know, you possessing a espresso machine that you are selling on the open market, imagine that the community has assets. And so we'll think of the espresso machine as being an asset of the community itself. And what you have is a possessory right to the espresso machine. So you have a right to use the espresso machine on an individual basis. And the different people in the community have differing endowments of a special community currency. Now, you can make transactions within the community, and what you're transacting is instead of selling the sort of absolute property rights, you're selling the possessory interest. You're selling the right to use the community's espresso machine on an individual basis. So what happened there is that, you know, you saw the transaction where the community currency moved from the person on the right to the person second to the right, and the possessory interest switched to that person. Now, there's still other people out there in the world with differing willingnesses to pay in dollars for the espresso machine. And in some cases, we might want those transactions to happen. But the difference in this model is that if the espresso machine is to be sold on the open market like that, it wouldn't be an individual decision to sell it. Instead, it would be a community decision. So the community might make a collective decision to sell the espresso machine. And if that happens, then the you know, money from some outside purchaser comes into the community treasury. The espresso machine goes out, and then the possessor of the espresso machine within the community is compensated in the form of community currency. And so now we can see that it's possible for this transaction outside of the community to happen in a way that basically respects the integrity of the community, doesn't weaken the ties of the community, doesn't discourage the people within the community from focusing on the needs of the community in their commercial interactions, and leaves every individual within the community better off than they were before. So this is, you know, in fairly stark contrast to the picture where everyone is just using the same unit of account, right? Dollars or euros or bitcoins or whatever it may be. So why hasn't this happened before, right? Why haven't community currencies taken off? Now, I don't want to minimize the good things that community currencies have achieved. You know, there have been a lot of people interested in the idea of strengthening local economies, strengthening communities through complementary or special currencies. People have been interested in this for a very, very long time. But it hasn't, you know, and it's done a lot of, you know, there's been a lot of good work done with it, but it hasn't really changed the world. It hasn't really like revolutionized the way that transaction and money works, obviously, right? I think it's fairly clear that we still live in a world of like the almighty dollar, or you know, if you talk to Bitcoin maximalists, they'd like us to live in the world of like almighty Bitcoin. And you know, and also one just quick thing sort of not to get confused by is like, even if the world does kind of move towards something more like a basket of currencies as opposed to one dominant currency like the dollar, that doesn't really change this, right? You know, the sort of basket of currencies is still fulfilling this function of being like a universal currency, right? That is not what I mean by sort of a diversity of community currencies. Now, the reason it hasn't happened before, I'm going to argue, is that we haven't had the sort of tools to basically build like membranes around communities that enable the energy of internal economies to be held in within themselves. So just to make that I'm going to explain this a bit more here, but to make that a little bit more concrete, here's what I have in mind. When people, use community currencies conventionally, they tend to basically just perform a sort of a mental translation from the community currency into a global currency. So if I accrue X number of community currency dollars, I'm generally just going to be thinking about how many actual United States dollars that's worth, or how many euros that's worth. And I will probably take the first chance I get to basically exchange that community currency out into dollars. And I think that this mentality, that kind of relationship with community currencies, is the reason that they haven't succeeded. You need to build systems that that discourage people from just thinking in dollars, and that discourage people from exchanging the community currency out, so that people, essentially rest their attention within the community and are sort of happy to interact with the community through the community's currency. In order to make that happen, in order to sort of depict how I think we can make that happen, it's useful to bring in the metaphor of like a membrane surrounding a cell. So if you think about a biological cell, right? It's got lots of components within it, lots of complexity happening inside of it, and it's got a membrane surrounding it. And if it didn't have that membrane, all of the parts inside of it would just scatter off in 1,000 different directions, and you wouldn't have a cell, right? It needs to be held together by this kind of barrier. But at the same time, that barrier can't be absolute, right? So cells have these things called transport proteins, which enable chemicals and resources to be intelligently transported in and outside of the cell according to the needs of the cell and according to the needs of the overall body. And this is the kind of thing that we need to build basically around communities and community currencies for this version of money to take root. And I think that until fairly recently, we just haven't had very effective or convenient tools for building these membranes. I think that now we do. So let me explain what I mean by that. So first, let's take a look at this kind of this blue line, which I explained before as like a possessory interest in a community good, right? So this, you can imagine this kind of individual possessory interest or right to use a community good as represented by a like a partial common ownership token. And so what I mean by that is tokens that that encode essentially something like Harburger taxation, if you're familiar with that, or salsa, if you're familiar with this idea in the radical exchange community. These are representations of essentially shared interests in community goods, in which the sort of negative externality on the community of exclusive individual interest is incorporated into the right itself. So this is basically like a better way of thinking about property interests that ensures that the community's interests are respected, and that efficient trade in the asset can happen. So so in other words, long story short, we can now represent rights to use through tokens in better ways than we could before. We can imagine those tokens representing the rights to use community assets, and then those tokens can be the things that are traded by within the community for using the community currency. Now, the second point is this sort of translation issue, which is what I was getting at before about how people are kind of quick to like translate their currency back into dollars. I think it's really important that people think in the community currency instead of only tracking how many dollars it's worth. So instead of having people do this, instead of having people basically just swap their community currency out for dollars, which starts to erode the strength of the community. You can imagine simply encoding a system in which when people transfer money out from the community, they pay a like an exit tax to the community. So that way, there is some ability for individuals to make unilateral decisions to essentially send community resources out of the community, but the community is able to collectively sort of set the tax or set the price for that kind of exit to occur. And so this kind of thing can just be, you know, encoded into the money using the tools that we now have available to us. So, you know, just as the sort of the rules concerning the right to possess community assets through a partial common ownership token, the rules for that can also be set by the community. So in other words, you know, maybe people who, you know, maybe just having community currency is enough to be able to buy it. Maybe you also need to be a member of the community itself, and not just, you know, you need to have some kind of standing within the community. There's all kinds of, there's a huge sort of governance design space here, but you can start to see how it's possible to build very usable, tractable digital assets that would be able to like hold the economic activity with economic energy within the community. Now, finally, I want to make the point that this is not a matter of, we start to think about community economics in this way. It's not a matter of like you pick a team and then that's your only team, right? We can imagine a very, very complex ecosystem of intersecting and overlapping communities so that you could participate simultaneously in many communities and accordingly use lots of different currencies. A few more quick points. So one concern with some of this is that people might sort of like game or fake their affiliation with communities in order to participate in community economies. There are interesting ways of making people's decisions to affiliate with communities incentive compatible using soul-bound tokens, which I can talk about a bit more in the discussion. Another concern with this kind of thing sometimes is inflation. So would communities just adopt like inflationary monetary policies so that none of these community currencies would be things that anybody wanted to hold? And the answer to that is that, you know, I think the right thing to do is to subject the monetary policy of each community to the democratic power of that community. So some of them might decide to be inflationary. Others might decide to have more like hard money policies so that it would be attractive to hold that currency. And relatedly, a slightly sort of corollary point here is there's tons of interesting things you can do with the sort of money creation function once you've given that over to communities. So the way that money creation normally works is like you've got a bank. Banks basically create money by in the form of credit to the most credit to the people or entities that the banks deem to be the most creditworthy, which is to say, banks create money and give it in the form of credit to the people who least need money in the society. If you had communities making their own money in this way, you'd sort of turn that on its head, right? You'd have basically democratic decisions to create money, and then that created money could go to could go basically to projects that the community deems to be providing the most common good. So you can think of this as happening through something like quadratic funding, right? So in a community, the source of new money, like instead of having the sort of the Federal Reserve or the government treasury like print off new money, the source of printed money could basically be the matching pool for quadratic funding processes, so that when people would decide through voting or by sending around their community currency to public goods projects that benefit the community, they would those decisions would also determine the who receives newly created money by the community. Finally, another point I'll make is I've been using the example of an espresso machine here just because it's very simple, but it's actually very, very interesting to think about shared information assets being the shared community assets that are backing community currencies. You can imagine something like data unions or data trusts or data coalitions, basically pools of information that the community co-creates, and using sort of strategic, careful disclosure of that information as one of the sources of value that the community currency unlocks. Okay, so my first claim is money is broken. My second claim is we can make it less broken. I hope I have sketched out the case for why that's so. And I know I've gone over time here, so just some quick thoughts. One is I want to say this is not just a feel-good thing, right? We actually have an opportunity to improve a very, very fundamental human institution here, but I'm worried that we're going in the wrong direction. I'm worried that the philosophy behind Bitcoin has kind of set some rails for how people think about money that are kind of 180 degrees opposite from where we need to go, which is instead of creating more universal units of account, we need to create more local ones and figure out how to support them. So in other words, we need money that helps us basically commit to our communities and strengthen them, right? If you universal currencies, one way of thinking about what they do, like as a tool, universal currencies are a tool for exit, right? If you accumulate a lot of money in Bitcoins or in dollars, what that enables you to do is to basically tell your community, I don't need you, I'm leaving, forget about you. It allows you to basically escape, exit from your community. Now, what if we had other kinds of money that instead of tools for exit, they were tools for commitment, so that by using other forms of currency, by using community-based forms of currency, we would be signaling, we'd be intentionally sending the signal and intentionally making a decision to commit some part of our economic lives to the well-being of that community, right? That's a very different intention and a very different space of possibility that could be opened up by new kinds of money. So yeah, I believe that by developing this, we can create a more pluralistic world. I think that this agenda gets at some of the most central problems related to highly centralized power, highly unequal power in the world, and if we can successfully pour ourselves into the project of letting 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of setting up robust community currencies, I think it could genuinely change the world. And that's it. Thanks, and yeah, curious what you think and any thoughts, any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. You've gotten a lot of love in the thread already for it, but yeah, I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts or questions they want to ask Matt. I know you all probably do.
Yeah, just one really blown away for the expression that you said about how an excess of money goes to an exit from your community. And I just placed a message, another message that often not only makes people get out of the community, but also now start exploiting the people from the community. So it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's I mean, I've been thinking a lot of actually. I mean, I think that it's interesting it's interesting to me to think about what the sort of sources of human well-being are, and here's what I mean by that. Like the so in so just as an initial matter, it's quite clear that most of the economic value in the world comes from communities, right? All of the valuable economic things that we do in collaboration with networks of people around us, right? So money that weakens those sort of ties, is in a sense like eroding some of the source of the well-being that money is supposed to efficiently unlock, right? So that's like one quick point. Another point related to this, which I think is kind of interesting, is if you think about and this is stated in a very rough way, but hopefully it'll be sort of thought-provoking, right? In many ways, in the past, like in past centuries, I think that a lot of the problems in people's lives, like a lot of the source of misery and oppression in people's lives, have come from their inability to escape their communities. So in other words, if you imagine, living in a village hundreds of years ago or something like that, right? There's a lot of oppressive stuff going on in these like pre-modern communities that, and that comprised a lot of the misery of most people's lives who were living 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago or whatever. So in a way, that sort of building up a tool to allow us to escape from communities, was and has been a source of like genuine human progress in many ways. But I think that we may be reaching a tipping point, basically, where essentially additional human well-being is not to be had from making it easier to escape from communities, but is instead to be had in the other direction. So in other words, the problem today, unlike 1,000 years ago, is not that we can't escape from our oppressive communities. The problem today is that we don't have any communities. So so thinking about reconstructing a form of monetary exchange, it would push economic energy back in that other direction. To me, that seems like that's the source of potential welfare gain today, as opposed to, making it easier to escape your community, which may indeed probably was, the like important source of welfare gain, 1,000 years ago or 200 years ago, whatever.
One of our builders at DreamDAO, Carl, he's from India, was like a huge advocate of the ABC approach, which is like asset-based community development. And essentially, the philosophy is that within the community, you're not trying to like uplift them through charity or create something entirely new, but like truly understand where their value is coming from and curate that. And so this is really wonderful. And I also heard about the fact that I think in the US, it's around like 80% of what the government provides its welfare goes to like monoliths like Amazon rather than supporting local businesses, which like erodes communities continually. So I think my only question would be like, how do we like reconcile this with the fact that we are still embedded within global supply chains and like keeping those accessible while orienting us back towards communities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that the answer is that if I can sort of go back to that slide where you think of where it depicts basically communities making exchanges on behalf of the community with a global market, you can see that this vision for this sort of alternative vision of currency does not does not exclude the possibility of global exchange and continuing to participate in global exchange, right? It's just that this could create avenues for communities to sort of participate, to create stronger like local economies and facilitate more exchange within themselves. And instead of every individual within the community spending all of their attention on the question of how to make the most efficient exchange globally, people within the community are spending more of their attention thinking about the efficient exchange locally, and the community as a whole is doing more of that thinking about efficient global exchange. So in other words, you could think of communities either democratically making some of these decisions about whether to make an exchange outside the community, or perhaps like delegating some of the power, to like someone within the community to do some thinking about how the community should interact economically with the rest of the world. So in other words, it's kind of you can think of it as sort of bundling a bundling of the public. So in other words, instead of like everybody scattered as individuals interacting with the whole global economy, we could imagine people more sort of clustered into organic clusters that represent their social ties, or their communal ties, and then kind of efficiently delegating or aggregating some of these decisions about how these local clusters are transacting with the macroscopic global network. So it's kind of like, so in other words, like the most efficient transactions, like the most obvious efficient welfare creating transactions with the global market would still occur, right? The community is still gonna, like, if there's somebody willing to pay like a huge amount of money for the espresso machine, the community is not going to miss that. The community is going to make that transaction. But it's just that like now we wouldn't have to have every individual focused on that question instead of focused on the question of how to transact locally.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, and then so that makes me have like a follow-up question, which would be, because there's going to be like inevitable competition between more of these community-focused bundling transactions versus like individualistic, like one-day shipping fans. I'm wondering like do you think that the advantages of this system be embedded more long term, or what would be like the immediate like short term benefits of shifting to this system?
I think that if we can stand up systems like this, I believe that over a period of months in the best case scenario, maybe probably takes a few years, I think, for this kind of thing to like really take root. But I think that it could create alternative avenues for people to secure their own welfare. So in other words, it would just basically, it would create new sort of professional and personal opportunities instead of just thinking about employers out there in the world. You could commit, maybe not all, but you could commit like a portion of your economic life to thinking about how to serve the interests of community X, community Y, and community Z, all of which you're a part of. And so some of your the economic return that you would get in your life would be, instead of dollars, it would be, you know, currency X, currency Y, and currency Z, which might turn out to be very valuable because they would allow you to avail yourself of the services of, you know, goods and services from other people within those communities. So you would basically just be, you know, committing yourself to more to more interdependence with the communities that you genuinely care about, and so I was going to say one more thing. Yeah, I mean, similarly, like, I forgot what I was going to say. Lost my train of thought.
That's really great because this is my last like follow-up, I guess, which would be like, what if we could sort of like add another dimension to this, like maybe like this is introduced plus like a UBI, because a lot of like our individualistic relationships are from the dynamic that we don't even have something to share with others. But if there is that like introduction of UBI, have this safety and like this like feeling of win-win, or like everyone wins, and maybe that could like more immediately incentivize them to welcome this.
Yeah, so I think, for example, a UBI is something that any of these communities could decide to do. So the, you know, one of the things that I view as kind of a cornerstone of the architecture of these kinds of currency communities is public goods support, like quadratic funding style public goods support. And so one of the so they might support any number of different things that secure the welfare of the stakeholders of the community. But one of those might be a UBI, right? The community might decide, okay, one of the public good projects we're going to support is UBI. And so, you know, X amount of currency Y is minted every month and given to everybody, and that's how our community is going to work, right? And yeah, and I think it'll be an interesting model, and I expect in certain cases it could be very successful.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. No, so I was wondering if you guys have had any case studies about like this thing that you kind of brought up about like, because for example, I think my experience is, wait, can you guys hear the echo? Or is it just me?
It's a little
I
echoey.
hear an echo, but I can still understand you.
Yeah, okay, let me move real quick. We're recording on the side. Okay, so I guess what I was trying to say is like what you say about this plural money, I think is really interesting because I've seen upfront how churches community have kind of implemented these like network and also money contribution, and it kind of goes inside a circle because, for example, my church community, they're trying to build a church for themselves, right? So they'll often do fundraising event. They'll often at the church they'll do like they'll pay for meals, or they'll people come in, they make food, and people in the community support those food, pay for it, contribute the money in, even if it's more expensive. They knowingly put it in for the purpose of supporting the church, and that money kind of go back into the community for other like programs and events. And it's actually really interesting to see like people are willing to put money into church for many reasons, and because they have the same value set. And I'm just saying, like, it's a really fascinating case study. I just wonder if there's any sort of case study already that's relevant to what you're talking about, plural studies. But yeah, other than that, I just think like I see. At first, it seems like this idea is, naturally radical because now you're talking about like not universal money, because universal money just feels like it's easier to exchange. The process is faster, and you have more decisions on your own autonomy, right? And I guess another question that I would have is like, what does governance look like? Because it just seems so hard for people to decide to vote to participate, to decide on one thing and push it forward without any sort of like major sentiment in opposition, which makes it turn political by nature. Like, what's your thought on that?
Yeah. Well, so one thing, I'll try to answer both parts of the question. I think that like church communities, faith communities, things like that are a really, really interesting case study for things like this. I could imagine church communities, faith communities becoming a very good example of the kind of community that could successfully use this kind of thing. And I think the sort of key to the key point to realize here is that where people now basically use like a universal currency to show their commitment to institutions they care about or to communities they care about, this would be another way of doing that. So in other words, basically by accepting payment in a community currency, that would be like another form of showing support for the community, similar to like just donating dollars to them. But in a way, it's actually more powerful than just donating dollars to them, because it's generating a self-sustaining internal economy that can actually start to build upon itself. The other sorry, can you remind me the second part of the question?
Yes, so like governance, like opinions, like
yeah,
people
thanks.
going together and actually create this token, right? Or decide the prices. You mentioned like the espresso, the community get to decide. Well, those are like tinier things, right? And then how do you scale that, right?
Yeah, I think that so there are a handful of decisions that the community would need to be able to make in order to administer this kind of thing, right? So, and I can roughly sort of name them now, right? Basically, the community will need to make decisions about its monetary policy. They'll need to figure out how it designates which public goods it wants to support. It'll need to figure out who's in charge of, it'll need to figure out how to make decisions about external transactions. So if somebody outside the community wants to buy the espresso machine, how does the community decide whether or not to do that? Is it a vote? Is it a delegated decision? And then then various other things. The community will need to decide basically how does it kind of deal with its boundaries, right? How can new people join the community? What are the rules around that? So it'll need to govern itself, and I think that there are lots of really promising tools for how to set up that governance, which is a lot of the other work that that I've participated in with Radical Exchange. So I think that tools like quadratic voting can help a lot of this stuff. Quadratic funding is an important part of the answer. Doing interesting things with soul-bound tokens are another interesting component here, and then I'll add that for some of the kinds of decisions that might need to be made here, it may make sense to delegate them to some kind of representative within the community, and in other cases you might want to set up things like sort of mini publics or councils. So like I'm quite interested in the idea of like citizens assemblies these days, and so for very large communities, I think it might make sense to basically have like sort of randomly selected or representatively selected cross sections of the community chosen when important decisions arise, and sort of put the decision to them, about how to adjust monetary policy or that sort of a thing. So yeah, so there's a number of governance problems that come into play here, but there's lots of interesting work on how to address them, and I'm excited to start to do more of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wonder if anybody else in the room have any like last questions to ask or like comment even to Matt before we end the session.
Just thanks for a really interesting session. Look forward to going back and watching over the video again later.
Yeah, Matt, I'm not sure if you know, but we were like talking in the thread about this conversation, and we brought it up a lot about urban planning and how the environment affects us as a community and how we see a community operate. Because like if you're like in New York, like San Francisco, you use buses and subway, and then you see its actual impact on like community transportation and so on, right? So yeah. I would love for you to check it out, the chat later, and if there's any question that you think you can respond there, feel free to comment there.
Yeah.
And everyone, yes. And everyone, we currently are now having a DAO vibe session where we talk about DAO vibes and also the grants. So hopefully see you guys there. And thank you so much again, Matt.
Thanks for having me. Great to speak with you all. And yeah, be in touch anytime. Matt at
Right,
radicalexchange.org.
Thank you. Yeah, feel free to share your like social media or something that so that we can follow you or and
Yeah.
what's up. Yep.